Yeah. First of all, the folks that have been arrested for participating in terrorist activity against innocent Israeli civilians have been arrested for criminal activity. They were not kidnapped because they were doing their responsible civic duty in no offensive position against Palestinians. In fact, those who are in Israeli jail are there for conducting terrorist activity. Among the people that he mentions that have been killed were killed because they were participating in terrorist activity, shooting missiles, planning terrorist attacks against Israel. Those folks were not innocent civilians who were killed in suicide bus bombings or who have had missiles fall on their kindergartens. There's a moral equivalency that your guest is drawing that is fundamentally out of.
May I ask Josh a question?
It's totally disproportionate and fundamentally incorrect.
May I ask Josh? I'd like to ask you a question, Josh. 1,000 of those Palestinian prisoners being held by Israel, according to B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization, 1,000 of them are administrative detainees. That is, there have been no charges leveled against them. How do you know what they're being held for?
Fundamentally...
no, answer that question. There have been no charges and no trial. How do you know what they're being held for?
You're trying to filibuster the question. Fundamentally, the Israeli army and the Israeli government arrest Palestinians who are engaged in terrorist activity. That's a proven fact.
No, I don't think that's a proven fact. It would be a proven fact if there were court trials.
It is a proven fact.
How do you know what administrative detainees are being held for? Israel doesn't say, so how do you know?
I fundamentally understand the facts, which clearly you do not, which are that Israel takes fundamental legal action to arrest individuals who are engaged in terrorist activity directed against its citizens. There is no moral equivalency to be drawn between a country acting in defense of its citizens and those engaging in terrorist activity in an effort to destabilize and destroy that free and peaceful society. Look, Amy and Juan, as a liberal Democrat who's a longtime listener of this program, I fundamentally believe that the audience and you are in a position to understand that liberal fundamental values which are celebrated in Israel, freedom of the press, women's rights, gay rights, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, are denied to those living in Palestinian areas and throughout the rest of the Arab world. There's an asymmetry that's involved in the Middle East, which is a country of Israel that is based on fundamental free values that is not replicated in the Arab world, where education systems inculcate children with hatred and teach them that martyrdom and death is preferred over science and math and education. And fundamentally, after Israel's disengagement from Gaza less than a year ago, when the Palestinian people and the authority that leads them had the chance to build a better life for their citizens, they chose not to do that. They destroyed the greenhouses, the economic infrastructure that was provided. They then took the opportunity not to fight terrorism and to provide security for their people and went the other direction. That's why when these attacks take place through the very arteries, the crossing points and the cargo points that benefit the Palestinian people, Hamas is intentionally harming their own society. That is the fundamental dynamic. None of the other speciousness that we're hearing from our other guests today.
But Josh Block, I'd like to ask you that on the targeted assassinations that Israel has often executed in Palestinian territories, we hear repeatedly of innocent civilians. Putting aside the fact whether the people who were targeted were actually terrorists or not, because we have Israel's reporting that they are, but the innocent civilians that are inevitably killed in these missile attacks, how is that justified as not terrorism against the civilian population?
No, you're absolutely right, and those incidents are deeply regrettable. I think any one of us would say that, and I think any American, any Israeli would say that innocent people who are killed as a result of a military action unintentionally that's a tragedy. But there's again a moral difference between an army. Israel's military goes to great lengths to prevent those kinds of incidents, and if you look at the number of preventative attacks that Israel has carried out, with the number of those who have been incidentally and unfortunately killed in those incidents, there's a tremendous preponderance of occasions when, in fact, Israel has gone to great lengths not to harm innocent civilians.
We just have a minute. We gave Josh Block the first word, Professor Norman Finkelstein the last.
Well, the question is whether or not there is a significant difference between what Israel does and what the Palestinians do, apart from the fact that Israel does it in a much higher proportion than Palestinians. if you indiscriminately fire on a civilian population, which Israel routinely does under international law, and here I can quote the president of Tel Aviv University, Yoram Dinstein, who's one of the leading international experts on these matters. He says there's no difference whatsoever between intentionally targeting civilians and indiscriminately firing into a civilian crowd. He says both of them are terrorism. So if Hamas blows up a bus, as it used to do in Tel Aviv, that's terrorism. If Hamas were to say we didn't intend to kill the civilians, we intended to blow up the bus, people would laugh. But if Israel drops allow me to finish. If Israel drops a 1-ton bomb on a densely populated neighborhood in Gaza, as it did in July 2002, and it said, oh, we didn't intend to kill the civilians, we just intended to kill a Palestinian terrorist, it would be considered as preposterous as if Hamas said we only intend to blow up the bus.
I'm sorry.
They're both terrorism.
There's been no apology from Hamas for those incidents. Israel apologizes when things like that happen.
Israel didn't apologize for it. As a matter of fact, Ariel Sharon hailed the bombing of Gaza City that time as one of the greatest acts in Israeli history.
Again,
we're going to have to leave it there.